Good morning. It is 10:16 a.m. on Saturday, June 23rd, 2018. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. I had a pretty good evening last night. I went out to see the Harmontown podcast live here in Boston, and it was a great time. And it wasn't that this show reminded me of it per se, of this issue per se. It was actually something I was thinking about. But I thought I wanted to talk a little bit about celebrity apologies, in particular because Chris Hardwick, who has some allegations against him recently, I won't go into them if you're not already familiar. Suffice to say that an ex-girlfriend has basically painted a pretty awful picture of him, and that Chris Hardwick is someone who I have been a big fan of in the past. I listened to hundreds of episodes of the Nerdist podcast. I watched a bunch of episodes of At Midnight. I actually saw him live once. I met him in person and shook his hand once at a Dragon Con. This is like not as distant a celebrity as many are from me. And the thing is, like, as much as I actually, was a fan, I will say, first of all, that I'd kind of drifted away from the Nerdist podcast in the last few years, and I don't want to take credit for that, like, oh, somehow I sensed this in him, and therefore I get credit for figuring something out. That wasn't it at all. But I will say that having listened to a lot of stuff from him, including times where he's gotten a little bit more vulnerable, opened up a little bit more about some of the things that he deals with, it makes a lot of her allegations sound very plausible to me, honestly. And so when he had these accusations, allayed against him, part of, like, they sounded awful, but a lot of them also sounded like things that come from darkness and insecurity and a need to control people, that I can imagine being like difficult psychological issues, which doesn't excuse the behavior, but I could get coming from that place. And so when these things came out, one of the big things that was kind of critical was like, what's his response going to be? Because this is something that I think is true generally, which is to say, all of us are capable of bad behavior sometimes, right? But what's an important thing to do, like an important human skill, is responding appropriately when you've hurt someone. And I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert at that, but it just meant that when this all started to blow up, I was watching carefully to see, like, well, what's he going to do? How's he going to respond? And honestly, his response suggested to me that he hadn't really learned much of anything about it. He was just immediately trying to deflect any legal blame for the worst part of it, didn't really acknowledge any of the rest of it, released her private text messages to try to say, like, oh yeah, but see, she wanted to get back together, so therefore she must not have been that unhappy. So I was thoroughly unimpressed with his response, and that, more even than just the accusations, has led me to say, no, not a fan anymore. But part of the reason that the show last night reminded me of that is just because Dan Harmon is also someone who has struggled with some of those same kinds of issues. And he is someone who's had accusations made against him. They're different, but he responded in a very different way. Like, for one, if you watch the Harmontown documentary, It doesn't really paint him in a very good picture. It paints him as someone who drinks too much and has a tendency to get unnecessarily and arbitrarily mean for the sake of it. Occasionally, he had some accusations against him of what a way he mistreated and then blackballed a female writer on Community. But the difference here is, having also listened to a lot of Harmontown stuff, and his other podcast, Whiting Wongs, which is actually about taking a look at like race issues and him trying to earnestly learn. He has presented this. He puts himself out there in a very vulnerable place of acknowledging his own imperfections and expressing a sincere desire to learn so that he can do better. And in particular, after he had sort of a similar blow up of allegations, someone explained these are all these awful things that he did to me. He came out on his podcast and he spent 10 minutes of his show being extremely, like, it's like the textbook apology, in the sense of he didn't try to make excuses for it. He said, here's kind of where my headspace was, but that does not excuse the behavior. Very sorry that I hurt this person. It's actually worse than they said because it had all of these other factors into it. I acknowledge that part of the issue was the power differential, and he basically just laid himself out with an excellent textbook apology where he did not make excuses, he did not blame her for anything, and he just really made himself vulnerable, and he's like, here's the things that I have tried to do since to be better and make sure that I never do anything like that again. And that makes me think, yeah, I am still a fan of this guy, because he does not present himself as perfect. Like, I don't want to say Chris Hardwick presents himself as perfect, but certainly he blamed her back after his accusations and basically didn't admit to anything. And like, in this world where nobody is perfect and yet we put all of this weight on certain celebrities, it's going to be an ongoing thing. Like, it's like a meme on Twitter these days to say, like, oh, you saw so-and-so's name trending and you're terrified because it might mean either that they're dead or that they've done something awful. And I think that's a joke because it seems like it's happening so often. And I think it's true that we have to sort of acknowledge that people are complex and have a lot of complicated reasons for their various types of behavior. But, like, if that's the reason, then they should work on it. It's not an excuse that justifies not having to do anything. It's not a get out of jail free card. Anyway, I really loved the Harmontown show last night. It was not about this stuff, but seeing him in the same theater that I once saw Chris Hardwick live made me think more about something that I had actually already been thinking about as a specific comparison. So this is a longer than usual 5 more minutes, but I guess I had stuff to say about it. So I guess the summary of the whole thing is that when allegations of having done something awful come out, I know that what I'm looking for frequently is, what is the accused person's response? And I think that Dan Harmon was classy and made a sincere apology that was incidentally accepted by the person who made the accusations against him. And of course, not everybody is going to feel like they're okay with, forgiving him. They don't have to. There's no obligation to. That's part of what was classy about his apology is he didn't even really essentially ask for forgiveness. He was just saying, I acknowledge I screwed up, and I'm very sorry that I hurt you, and here's how I'm going to try to do better, right? Whereas Chris Hardwick kind of basically said, nuh-uh, and she's awful too. And you know what? One of those I respect and the other I don't. All right, so in any event, I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes. But because tomorrow is Sunday, I'll be continuing my rewatch of The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. And in the meantime, I guess I used my sign-off already. See, I'm doing like the freeze frame thing, but then I have to actually look over to the command that stops the video.